Welcome once again to the Brownstone, Wolfe's sanctuary of logic, orchids, and murder. Do tell us where in the world you're listening from, and don't hesitate to share your thoughts. If you enjoy these cases, consider liking and subscribing. Now then, shall we begin? Nero Wolfe and the blonde who danced at dawn. Right now, over 85% of the people watching aren't subscribed. If you've been enjoying these Nero Wolfe stories, hitting that subscribe button is the best way to be sure you never miss the next mystery. Your support helps keep these stories alive and lets us keep bringing them to you. The hour was too early for comfort, too late for excuses. Dawn had not yet committed itself, and Manhattan still carried the flavour of night. Wet cobblestones that shone like tarnished silver, trolley bells clanging faint in the distance, and a drizzle so thin it felt more like breath against the skin than rain. I just stepped out of a cab on West 35th, hat brim angled low against the mist, when I saw her waiting beneath the shadow of Wolfe's stoop. A blonde trim in a raincoat that clung close at the waist, the hem brushing stockings darkened by wet pavement. She looked like trouble standing still, and when she moved it confirmed the suspicion. Her hand trembled as she drew a cigarette from a silver case, but she didn't light it. Instead, she fixed me with eyes that carried the wide, sleepless stare of someone who had danced too long and too hard and found the music sour at the end. "You're Archie Goodwin," she said. The voice was hushed but urgent. "That's me," I allowed, stepping closer. "And you'd be Miss—" "Lila Dane. I work at the Granada. Not that it matters." Her glance cut both ways along the street, like she expected a squad of masked shadows to leap out of the gloom. "I need to see Mr. Wolfe. At once. No delays, no appointments, no brush-offs." I looked at my watch, which showed 5 minutes to 5. Wolfe was at that hour buried deeper than Pharaoh. The only thing that would rouse him was fire in the walls, or Fritz dropping the entire breakfast tray. Still, there was something in her tone that told me she wasn't angling for a dance booking or a social call. "Miss Dane, I'll be frank," I said. "You've picked the wrong hour. Mr. Wolfe guards his sleep with more ferocity than most men guard their wallets. If I wake him now, I'll be the one who needs protection." Her grip caught my arm, tight as wire. "I don't care. If I wait, I'll be dead by noon." That got my attention. Women had thrown lines like that before, but the way her knuckles blanched and her mouth pressed tight showed it wasn't theatre. I gave her a nod and unlocked the brownstone door. Fritz was still asleep upstairs, so the hall lay dark and muffled, smelling faintly of polish and orchids from yesterday's greenhouse delivery. I ushered her into the office, the red leather chairs glistening in the lamplight I snapped on. She sat, raincoat still clutched about her, as if warmth was a luxury she couldn't afford. I called upstairs and, against my better instincts, rousted Wolfe. His voice came like a groan through the tube. "Goodwin, the sun has not risen." "Neither has Miss Lila Dane's courage," I told him. "But she claims she won't see noon unless she talks to you. If that doesn't earn an audience, nothing will." There was a pause, then the line clicked dead. 10 minutes later, Wolfe entered, vast and irritable, robe belted, slippers whispering against the carpet. His eyes, dark and heavy, swept the girl, then me. He lowered himself into the yellow chair as though pulled by gravity alone. "Well?" he demanded. Lila straightened, voice quivering only at the edges. "Mr. Wolfe, men of influence in this city are tied to a racket so deep it poisons everything it touches. Police, politicians, even the press. I have proof. I've seen it written, signed, transferred. But I can't speak names until I know I'll be safe." Wolfe's brows lowered like theatre curtains. "You presume much. You come into my house at an hour I detest. You speak of enigmas, and you expect I will pledge protection upon no evidence. I am not the municipal guardian." Her eyes darted toward me, seeking sympathy, then back to Wolfe. "I danced last night at the Granada. After closing I overheard 2 men. They spoke of a ledger, of payments, of a dawn meeting at which something final would be arranged. They mentioned my name. One said the blonde was getting ideas." She clasped her hands to still them. "I'm that blonde." I shifted in my chair. The Granada wasn't just a club. It was where uptown society rubbed elbows with racketeers in tuxedos. If she had overheard what she claimed, she was lucky to have walked away with her throat unsliced. Wolfe sniffed, displeased. "You have offered me a handful of smoke. Where is this proof?" "I can bring it, but not yet. They're watching me. If I make a move alone, they'll know. I need a guarantee first, that you'll take me in, that you'll keep them from silencing me before I can speak." Wolfe shifted slightly, which for him equaled another man's leap. "Phooey! Protection is the function of the police. Inspector Kramer will receive you." "No!" She surged forward, eyes blazing. "Kramer's precinct has men in their pocket. If I go there, I'm lost. I came here because you're the only man they can't buy." For a moment, silence reigned. The drizzle tapped faintly at the panes, and the clock gave a discreet cough of chime at the quarter hour. Wolfe's fingers tapped the chair arm. His gaze slid to me, as though to measure whether I found this circus entertaining. "I'll admit she's persuasive," I said, "and terrified. That's usually not staged at this hour. If she has documents, that ledger or whatever it is, it could be a card worth playing." Wolfe closed his eyes. "Goodwin, your susceptibility to distressed women is a constant reproach." He reopened them, heavy lids narrowing. "Miss Dane, you will be precise. What is this dawn waltz you alluded to?" Her lips parted, then closed again. She seemed to wrestle with herself, then whispered, "That's what they called it. The dawn waltz. I don't know if it's code or a meeting, but it happens today, at first light. I was supposed to be there, but I knew it was a trap. If I attend, I won't return." "Where?" Wolfe asked. "The alley behind the Granada. That's all I know." She swallowed hard. "I swear I'll bring you the ledger pages tonight if you'll only let me stay here until then. If not, I'll be gone before the city wakes." Wolfe considered her, mass immovable, mind circling. I knew the signs. He was intrigued despite his protests. His lips curved down, not up. "Miss Dane, I do not harbour fugitives, nor do I play nursemaid. But you have roused a filament of curiosity which is nearly as rare as compassion in me. You may return this evening with your evidence. Until then, you will guard your own neck." Her face fell, then tightened with resignation. She stood slowly, raincoat wrapped again like armour. "Then I'll try, but if I don't make it back, remember the dawn waltz." She moved past me, scent of cheap perfume and rain following. The front door shut with a soft finality. Wolfe grunted, adjusting himself deeper into the chair. "Goodwin, you will, of course, follow her at a discreet distance." "Of course," I said. The drizzle had thickened into rain by the time I reached the street. Lila Dane was already striding east, head low, coat pale against the gloom. I trailed her, every sense tuned to the still hour, the faint rattle of an early truck, the echo of shoes against wet stone. She walked with the step of one rehearsing her own funeral march, and though I kept her in sight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already too late. The rain had turned from drizzle to a steady curtain by the time I reached the corner of Broadway and 14th, where the lamps strained to cast light through fogged glass globes. My hat brim shed water in a slow drip that tapped against my collar. I had tailed Lila Dane as far as the Granada's block, but the traffic of night workers, paper boys, and delivery men made the street a blur of motion, and somewhere in the mix, she vanished. I searched the main drag, then ducked into the narrow alley behind the theatre. The cobblestones there were slick, and the air smelled of spoiled beer, coal smoke, and the faint sweetness of cheap perfume. That was where I found her. She lay against the damp wall, body curled as though the last effort of breath had folded her in on herself. The rain glazed her hair into streaks of pale gold. Her handbag lay open beside her, and from it I saw the satin gleam of dance shoes, neatly paired, untouched by mud. The sight of them hit harder than the body itself. She had kept them close, perhaps meaning to change, perhaps meaning to keep a piece of her stage life even at dawn. Her throat, pale against the shadows, bore the dark imprint of fingers. Whoever silenced her had done so swiftly and without pity. I crouched, checked pulse though I knew better. Stone-cold truth met my fingertips. No witnesses, no noise except water in the gutter. If the ledger had been on her, it was gone. Within 15 minutes, the alley was a hive. A patrolman had answered my call, then the precinct wagon clattered up, followed by the solid tread of Inspector Kramer. He arrived with his hat pulled low, coat collar turned up, and the expression of a man dragged from bed only to find the city just as rotten as he had left it. His eyes, red with irritation, locked on me. Goodwin, he barked. I should have known you'd be sniffing around. She came to us first, I replied evenly. She wanted Wolfe, said she had proof of something big. Kramer spat into the gutter, not from disgust but habit. Then she picked the wrong address. She's dead, and I've got to explain why a dancer from the Granada ends up strangled 2 blocks from Broadway. That club's tied up with more politicians than City Hall itself. He crouched beside the body, studied the mark on her throat, then the shoes. Neat little package. Only thing missing is the bow. I let him stew while the photographer's flash popped against the wet stone, sending white light across the body. The uniform boys kept back the curious, who had begun to gather like pigeons around breadcrumbs. I stood, hat-brim dripping, and looked down the alley mouth. No figure lingered. Whoever had done this was long gone. Kramer rose with a grunt. All right, Goodwin. Tell me what she said to you. She was scared, I answered. Claimed she had proof of a racket involving men with influence. Wanted Wolfe's protection before she'd show anything. She mentioned something called the Dawn Waltz. Said it was supposed to happen today. Then she left. You see the rest. He narrowed his eyes. And Wolfe? Did he take the bait? You know Wolfe. He doesn't stir for riddles without meat on the plate. He told her to bring proof tonight. Too late for that, Kramer muttered. He waved to the patrolman. Bag her. Careful with those shoes. Back at the brownstone an hour later, I peeled off the rain-soaked coat and entered the office. Wolfe was seated already, dressed, but his scowl showed he had not forgiven me for interrupting his sleep. The orchids had been tended early, and their perfume drifted faintly through the open door. Fritz had laid out breakfast, eggs, sausage, hot rolls. Wolfe had touched none of it. Well? He demanded, as if my absence had been a personal affront. She's dead, I said flatly. Strangled behind the Granada, handbag still there, dance shoes intact, ledger missing, if it was ever on her. His eyes closed briefly. Phooey. Women are not constructed to wage war with wolves, and yet they insist. He shifted in his chair, the leather groaning under his weight. Did she speak more of this dawn waltz? No, only that it would happen at first light and that it was a trap. Kramer's already sniffing politics. He thinks it touches City Hall. As if on cue, the bell rang. Fritz opened the door and Inspector Kramer's bulk filled the frame a moment later. He entered without waiting for an invitation, dripping onto the rug. Wolfe's mouth compressed, but he said nothing. Wolfe, Kramer began, your errand boy found her. You expect me to believe she just wandered in here before her death and you know nothing? I expect you, Wolfe said coldly, to employ that mass of muscle above your shoulders for reason. Miss Dane came, yes. She offered nothing tangible, only whispers. I instructed her to return with proof. That she was then murdered suggests her fears had foundation. Kramer planted himself in one of the red chairs, leaning forward like a man about to tackle an opponent. The Granada is a front. Gambling girls, kickbacks, you know the type. But this is deeper. There are names in that ledger that'll blister paint off City Hall if they're printed. If she had it, someone powerful wanted it back. Now she's gone, and I've got to keep the lid on while my men search every closet in Manhattan. Wolfe's lids lowered. You will not find it by rummaging. You will find only dust. If the woman's intention was to deliver it here, logic dictates her killer either removed it or she concealed it elsewhere. Both require more thought than your bluster allows. Kramer's jaw tightened, but he knew better than to trade insults when Wolfe's tone shifted from disdain to deduction. He tapped ash from his cigar into the tray Fritz had hurriedly placed, then stood. Fine. If you get wind of anything, and I mean anything, you'll call me, or I'll make life so miserable you'll beg for peace. He left, trailing smoke. Wolfe exhaled, not smoke but annoyance. Confound it, Goodwin. The woman has made me her custodian in death. Though I refused her in life, it is intolerable. She died on your doorstep, I reminded him. That makes it personal. Whether you like it or not, this case has your name written across the cover page. And if that ledger surfaces, you'll either solve it or watch Kramer hang it on your wall. For a long while he said nothing, only stared at the orchids through the open door as though their still perfection could counterbalance human folly. Then, heavily, he reached for a roll. Very well. Since you have thrust me into the dance, we shall waltz. The Granada wore last night's revels like a hangover. Chairs still leaned at angles from the floor show, and the scent of champagne mingled with stale tobacco and floor polish. The stage curtain, faded crimson, hung heavy as though weighed by the secrets it had seen. It was mid-morning, which made the emptiness feel louder. A janitor mopped near the bar with the indifference of a man who had heard too many arguments echo off those walls. I showed him my license, and he jerked a thumb toward the manager's office. The manager was Joseph Klein, a small man with a bald dome polished enough to catch the light. His tie was crisp, but his eyes carried sleepless baggage. He eyed me as if I'd walked in with a writ. "You're Archie Goodwin," he said, voice thin. "She mentioned you once, the Dane girl." "She won't be mentioning anyone again," I told him. "She came to Wolfe looking for protection. Now she's a corpse. That puts your club on my itinerary." His lips pursed, but he didn't flinch. She was trouble. Lovely, sure, but restless. Always asking questions, sticking her nose into men's business. Not wise for a girl in her position. "What business?" I pressed. He shuffled papers needlessly. "She had patrons. Every dancer does. Some spend a little, some spend a lot. Harold Vance, for example. A man with money, connections uptown. He liked her company. Kept her in dresses finer than our pay could buy. If anyone felt proprietary, it was him." I made a note, though I already knew the name. Vance had a reputation for moving between the arts and politics like a fox through henhouses. "And her partner?" I asked. "The one on stage," Klein grimaced. "Carl Ritter, a fine dancer, but vain. He thought the audience came for him, not her. When he realized the truth, he soured. She threatened to break the act last month. He begged her not to, but the act was finished, believe me. If jealousy kills, he's your man." I left Klein with his papers and followed the hollow echo of dance shoes on wood. In the practice hall, Ritter was stretching, lean as a greyhound, hair slicked into place with military precision. He moved with the grace of a cat and the eyes of a man who measured himself in mirrors. "You're wasting time," he said when I introduced myself. "Everyone wants to know who killed her, but none asks what killed her. It was ambition. She wanted out, wanted more. I could have given it if she'd trusted me." "You quarrelled," I said. His jaw set. "We quarrelled every day. Dance is quarrel. But I never touched her off stage. If I had, she would have come back. You can't strangle a woman and still expect her to need you." He laughed without humour, then returned to his stretches, shutting me out. From the hall I stepped into the musicians' room, where the smell of brass polish and cigarettes still lingered despite the absence of players. A drummer lounged with a stick twirling idly. He looked up, shrugged. "Lila?" She was nice enough, but she listened too much. She cornered Ruzza once, Dominic Ruzza, the man who signs the checks nobody sees, asked about the books. That's not a dancer's line. The name pricked my ears. Ruzza was a silent investor with a prohibition pedigree, rumoured to have made fortunes running liquor from Jersey to Manhattan. He kept quiet now, but quiet men often had the loudest pasts. I left the club and headed uptown, where Harold Vance's apartment stood in a polished stone building, guarded by a doorman who eyed me as though he'd prefer I vanish. My credentials and a $10 smile did the trick. Inside, the air smelled of leather and imported cigars, though none burned at that moment. Vance greeted me in a robe finer than most suits, hair slick, features smooth from a lifetime of tailored privilege. "Miss Dane was charming company," he said as we settled in the drawing room. His tone was casual, but his fingers tapped the armrest. She had grace, poise, and a sharp wit. That wit was dangerous. She didn't know when to hold her tongue. "Did you?" I asked. His eyes hardened. "I provided her with comfort, introductions, evenings worth remembering. She provided companionship, a fair exchange. But when she hinted she had something that could ruin friends of mine, I told her to be careful, very careful. If she's gone, it's tragedy, nothing more." I took in the decor, Persian rugs, framed playbills, photographs of governors shaking his hand. A man woven into the fabric of the city, but threads can strangle too. I left him to his luxury. By dusk I had the picture drawn. Klein the manager, who disliked her probing, Ritter the jealous partner, whose pride had been bruised, Vance the patron, protective of his influence, and Ruzza the silent man with a murky past. Each had reason to silence her, None had the opportunity written in ink. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in his chair, orchids tended, glass of beer within reach. He listened as I laid the suspects one by one, his eyes half closed. Fritz moved quietly, setting supper on the sideboard. "So," Wolfe murmured when I finished. "A circle of motive, yet no hand at the throat. Typical. They all hated what she represented, yet perhaps not her. It will be the ledger that tells us. Until then, we must endure the babble." "Kramer will be delighted," I said dryly. Wolfe's eyes opened, sharp now. "Pfui. Kramer is already ensnared. This affair reeks of influence. We are in it, Goodwin. Whether I consented or not, that girl made us her heirs." The clock ticked softly, and the city outside hummed with evening traffic. Somewhere uptown, a wealthy patron poured another drink. Somewhere downtown, a dancer practiced with a new partner. And beneath it all, the truth waited, silent as Rosa's fortune, patient as Wolfe himself. The rain had washed most of Manhattan clean by the time I returned to the alley, though clean was never a word to fit it. The air carried the sting of coal smoke from tenements, the brine of the river drifting inland, and the sharp tang of iron where water cut over rusted drain grates. Street lamps glowed through mist, halos blurred against wet brick. The Granada's back wall loomed dark, the painted advertisement peeling in long strips, letters that once promised joy now flaking into obscurity. The alley's slick stones held echoes of the night before, and I had the distinct feeling that Lila Dane had not walked alone into her grave. Kramer had posted 2 men to keep gawkers from spoiling his evidence, though by morning their patience had sagged. One nodded me through, muttering that I'd best not take too long. The body was gone, carted to the morgue, but the space she had occupied seemed still etched with her outline. Her handbag's chalked position marked the ground, and the wet stone held the faint indentation of where her shoulder had rested. I crouched low, the brim of my hat grazing the damp air, and traced the scuff marks that ran along the wall. The stones told a story, though not the one Kramer preferred. There were faint arcs of shoe leather deeper at the toe, dragged into crescents by weight and panic. 2 sets, not one, parallel in their rhythm yet jagged, overlapping near the wall. Whoever had gripped her had not been alone. 2 men had dragged her, boots grinding against slick cobbles, straining to keep her upright or silent. The rain had blurred edges but had not erased intent. Closer to the gutter, half concealed beneath a trickle of water, I saw it, a small cardboard matchbook, the lettering blurred but still legible. I pried it loose, wiped it against my sleeve. The front bore the Granada's emblem, gilt dancers frozen in mid-step above block letters. I opened it. 3 matches gone, the rest intact. Not unusual, half the city carried Granada matches, but its presence beside Lila's body spoke louder than chance. I pocketed it and rose just as Kramer's voice rolled down the alley. "Goodwin, I told you last night. What more do you expect to find? Ghosts?" He was built like a bull in a raincoat, his hat pulled low, his cigar stub chewed nearly to pulp though unlit. 2 detectives trailed him, their notebooks already open, prepared to record only what he told them to. He stomped toward me, the puddles parting around his weight. "Ghosts don't leave footprints," I said. "But killers do. 2 sets. They dragged her here, Kramer. Look at the scuffs. 1 man doesn't need to pull her like that. 2 did." He bent, grunted, peered at the marks as though they might rearrange into something he preferred. "Rain makes patterns, Goodwin. You see what you want? I see a girl strangled because she poked her nose into men's games." "And the matchbook?" I asked, drawing it from my pocket, turning it so the gold lettering caught the weak light. Kramer's lip curled. "The Granada owns half the block. You could scoop matchbooks from the gutter any hour. That doesn't make it a clue." "It makes it something," I countered. "She danced there. She feared them. Now their calling card rests in the gutter beside her." He reached, snatched it, flicked it open with a thumb. 3 matches missing. So what? Could be hers. "It wasn't in her handbag," I said. "I checked. These were dropped by a man too hurried to mind what fell from his pocket." He slammed it shut and stuffed it into his coat. "Leave the theorizing to me, Goodwin. Wolfe can have his orchids. I'll handle corpses." He turned, barked orders to his men to check doorways, though their glances showed no belief they'd find anything. I stayed where I was, studying the stones, tracing in my mind the scene. 2 men, 1 on each arm, dragging her from the street mouth toward the shadows. She fought, hence the arcs of leather at the toes. They subdued her here, pressed her against the wall. Then silence. They left the shoes in her bag, untouched, almost reverent. By the time I reached the brownstone, noon shadows had shifted across the office. Wolfe sat anchored in his yellow chair, a bottle of beer sweating faintly on the stand beside him. Fritz had just retreated, leaving the scent of coffee and fresh bread behind. Wolfe looked up as I entered, expression somewhere between disdain and curiosity. "Well?" he asked. I laid the scene before him, detail by detail. The scuffed marks, the arcs of leather, the matchbook with its missing trio. I painted it as clear as the rain had allowed. He listened, lids heavy, fingers steepled across his stomach. When I finished, he spoke with the measured tone of a judge passing sentence. "Kramer dismisses the prince? As Weathers work. He likes his corpses simple. Phooey. Rain may blur but does not invent symmetry. Two men indeed. That she fought suggests she believed her burden worth resistance. That is the only value here. And the matchbook? Too convenient to ignore. Kramer calls it coincidence. I call it carelessness." Wolfe's eyes glinted. "You call it evidence. Rightly so. No coincidence is admissible until exhausted of purpose. A man linked to the Granada carried it. He stood close enough to her body for it to fall. Therefore, the Granada's circle narrows." I dropped into the red chair, stretching legs that had tracked too many puddles. Kramer will brush it aside until it fits his hammer. That could take weeks. "It will take me less," Wolfe said flatly. "Small things, Goodwin. Small things unmake men. The scuff of leather, the loss of paper. They believed the rain their accomplice. They erred. You will pursue these threads, for they will bind us to the heart." The clock chimed softly, marking the hour. Outside, a truck rumbled past, its tires hissing on wet stone. The city moved on, indifferent, but in the quiet office the weight of two scuffed paths and one careless matchbook settled like lead. The case, whether Kramer wished it or not, had its first true clues, and Wolfe, reluctant though he claimed, was already pulling them into his grasp. The Granada looked different when champagne glasses were stacked empty and the tables stood bare of linen. The chandeliers, still dusty with the residue of last night's smoke, swung faintly in the draught from an open service door. The parquet floor, scuffed from endless foxtrots, gleamed under a fresh polish, but the echo of laughter and clinking glasses seemed to hang like perfume in the air. I'd arranged to meet Henri Duval, the maitre d', who had the kind of spine that bent for cash and stiffened for appearances. He was tall, lean, with hair combed sharp and a bow tie fixed with the precision of a surgeon. He guided me to a side booth near the bar, as though conspiracies required cushioning. He lit no light, letting the afternoon glow filter through high windows, and folded his hands with the grace of a man born to pour champagne and silence questions. "You wish to know about Mademoiselle Dane," he began in a voice soaked with vowels. "I can tell you this. She was not only a dancer, she was also a woman who understood leverage." "Leverage?" I asked, stretching my legs. "Or blackmail?" His eyes flicked toward the empty stage, then back. "There are patrons who pay for the pleasure of a smile, for the brush of a hand during a dance. Others pay for silence. She had one such, very distinguished, very careful. He thought his secrets buried. She knew otherwise." "Name?" Henri shook his head delicately. "Names here are like bubbles in a glass. Too many, they vanish. Too few, the drink is flat. But I assure you, she collected them. I saw her once slipping an envelope into her bag, while her benefactor sweated like a man under the noonday sun. It was not affection that bound them." I leaned in. "You think she pressed him?" "I think she pressed too hard. Blackmail is a waltz with a knife at one's back. Step too quick, the blade finds its mark." He rose slightly, smoothing his lapel. "You asked, I have answered. Be careful, monsieur. The Granada entertains not only with champagne." He left me with the faint scent of cologne and suspicion. I wandered through the dressing halls, where mirrors lined with bare bulbs reflected a dozen shades of tired glamour. Costumes lay draped across chairs, sequins catching stray light like scattered stars. A young dancer sat cross-legged at one mirror, brushing powder across her cheeks with the solemnity of ritual. She looked up, eyes large, lips faintly painted. "You're Archie Goodwin," she said without introduction. "You're asking about Lila." "That's right. You knew her?" "I shared her dressing table once. She was kind but restless, always writing notes between rehearsals." She set the brush down, voice lowering. "The night before she died, I saw her with a letter. She tore it in half, then quarters, then tossed the pieces into the waste bin like it burned her fingers. I thought it was from that uptown man, Vance, but maybe not. She looked frightened, not angry. I wish I'd kept the pieces." "You're sure?" I asked. She nodded, hair glinting beneath the bulbs. "I swear it. I was there after the last number." She said nothing, just ripped and dropped. Then she left quick, coat tight. I never saw her again. The waste bin, of course, was emptied long before I arrived. I checked anyway. Only cold ashes from powder puffs and lipstick-stained tissues. If she had destroyed evidence, it was gone. By the time I stepped back onto the street, the contradictions itched like a collar too tight. Henri said she kept an envelope, blackmail in its purest form. The girl swore she had destroyed one, torn to fragments before vanishing into the rain. Both stories bore the air of truth, yet both cancelled the other. If she intended to cash her chips with a patron, why rip the letter? If she destroyed evidence, why whisper about proof and ledgers to Wolfe? I returned to the brownstone, raincoat slung over my arm, and found Wolfe as expected, seated with his eyes half-lidded, lips resting in a downward bow, orchids gleaming faint in the adjacent room. Fritz brought in a tray of sliced bread and cheese, set it without sound, and departed. Wolfe raised a brow as I reported. "Henri claims blackmail," I said. "One of her patrons pressed until he sweated." An envelope slipped into her bag. Wolfe grunted, dismissive yet attentive. "Then a dancer swears she tore a letter to pieces the night before she died. No envelope, no evidence, just fear." He opened his eyes, fixed me with the weight of still water. "Two tales, both unverified, both contradictory. Which do you favour?" "I favour neither. If she tore something, why whisper to us about proof? If she kept something, why vanish without it?" "Precisely," Wolfe murmured. "Phooey. Both stories are convenient. Convenient for whom, I cannot yet say. One wishes to show her reckless, the other to show her cautious. Such opposites suggest design." "You think they're planted?" "Possibly. Or one is truth, one invention. But which? That is your burden." He reached for bread, dismissing me as surely as if he had rung a bell. I leaned back in the red chair, watching him chew slowly, methodically. Contradictions circled like dancers on the Granada floor, each step leading back to where I began. When I left him to his supper, the city outside had grown dark. Neon flared against puddles, car horns echoed across avenues, and somewhere the strains of a saxophone bled into night air thick with fog. I carried with me two images of Lila Dane, one clutching an envelope as leverage, another tearing a letter to shreds like a frightened child. Only one could be true, but which truth belonged to her, and which to the men who wished her silent, remained hidden in the shadows. The office was warm despite the November damp pressing against the windows. Fritz had seen to the fire early, and it hummed low in the grate, pushing a faint glow across the carpet. The orchids, trimmed and ordered, stood in their glass house beyond the door, but their perfume had drifted faintly into the room, as though they were unwilling witnesses. Wolfe sat in his yellow chair, immovable, broad hands resting like anchors on the armrests, eyes closed in apparent contemplation. The desk lamp burned steadily, throwing light across the sheen of wood. I was perched at my own desk, pencil between fingers, watching the clock nudge toward noon when the bell rang. Fritz answered, and a moment later Inspector Kramer stormed in, shoulders squared, face red with exertion and temper. His hat was clutched in one hand, and his coat collar dripped with the residue of street fog. He didn't wait for pleasantries, nor for permission to sit, but dropped heavily into one of the red leather chairs with the force of a man nailing down his position. The chair creaked in protest. "Wolfe," he barked, "I've had enough of this dance. You're sitting on information. That girl came to you, and you know more than you're giving." Wolfe opened his eyes, slow, deliberate, like a curtain being raised. "Inspector," he said, voice smooth as butter but sharp beneath, "I withhold nothing, because nothing has been offered to me. Miss Dane spoke in riddles and left. She was murdered thereafter. That is the entirety of my involvement." Kramer slapped his hat against his knee. Don't feed me that. She told you something. Otherwise, why come here at dawn? She didn't pick your brownstone out of a hat. She trusted you, and now she's dead. If you're covering for yourself, or worse, for some patron of hers, I'll see you dragged in. Wolfe's brows twitched, though his frame remained fixed. Your assumption rests on faulty footing. She came here, yes, but she withheld substance. To suggest otherwise is to attribute invention to me. I do not invent, I observe. Kramer leaned forward, eyes hard, jaw set. Then observe this, Wolfe. I've got a body strangled in an alley, a club dripping with politics, and your name in her last conversation. You're not a bystander. You're in it, like it or not. Phooey, Wolfe replied with a curl of his lip. I am dragged, not entered. You have responsibility. You have authority. You also have impatience, which leads you to demand conclusions where only fragments exist. I watched, amused but cautious. Wolfe had met Kramer's temper before, but the inspector looked fit to crack the desk in half with his fist. Fritz lingered at the door, silver tray in hand, pretending to adjust a glass, though his eyes flickered toward Wolfe. He never spoke in such moments, but the set of his shoulders betrayed tension. Even he had felt the shift since the girl's visit, as though Wolfe's annoyance carried weight beyond words. Kramer thumped his hat down on the desk. Fragments? You've got footprints, a matchbook, talk of some ledger. Don't tell me you haven't drawn a line already. You always do. Wolfe sighed, the sound heavy with contempt. A line without direction is a doodle. Yes, there were prints. Yes, there was a matchbook. What do they tell us? Only that two men moved her, and one of them frequents the Granada. That is fact, not conclusion. Until the ledger appears, nothing points to identity. Were I to claim otherwise, I would be guilty of your vice, bluster. Kramer's fist slammed the desk. The pencil rolled from my hand. The orchids quivered faintly in their frames of glass. You think you're clever, Wolfe, sitting fat in that chair while men bleed. That girl died asking for you. If you had taken her in, she'd be alive. Don't forget that. For a moment the room was silent, only the faint tick of the clock audible. Wolfe's eyes narrowed, his bulk shifting, not in retreat, but in controlled anger. Inspector, if you presume to lay her death at my door, I suggest you revisit your oath. I did not summon her. I did not strangle her. I did not employ the men who dragged her. She was a fool, perhaps, but fools deserve pity, not execution. You may rage at me, but it will not alter fact. I leaned forward. Kramer, you know Wolfe. If he had more, he'd crow about it just to spite you. He doesn't gamble with half a deck. He waits until every card is turned. Kramer shot me a glare, but the edge of his rage dulled. He knew the truth of it, though he hated admitting it. His shoulders sagged slightly, and he retrieved the hat, smoothing the brim. If you sit on something, Wolfe, and another body falls, it'll be on you, and I'll be here with cuffs. Spare me, Wolfe said, closing his eyes again. You will find no body here, only orchids and my patience, which wears thin. Kramer rose, coat flaring, boots stamping toward the door. He paused only to scowl back. One day, Wolfe, your smugness will hang you. Then he was gone, the door slamming like a verdict. Fritz stepped forward, setting the tray softly on the stand. His hands lingered longer than needed on the arrangement. Then he spoke, voice low but clear. Herr Wolfe, the inspector's anger is no greater than yours. You have been tense since the girl. Wolfe's eyes flicked open, briefly startled at the intrusion. Fritz rarely spoke his mind. Then Wolfe nodded once, curt. Yes, her folly has imposed upon me. It is intolerable. I smirked. Intolerable, but you're hooked. Admit it. She walked in at dawn, and now you're pacing inside even if your feet stay planted. That ledger, those footprints, that matchbook, they're already building a tower in your head. You'll climb whether you want to or not. Wolfe reached for his beer, raised it, and drank slow, savouring, as if each swallow cleansed Kramer's words from the air. Then he set it down, eyes closing once more. Goodwin, attend to your notes. When evidence breathes, I will speak. Until then, silence. The fire hissed softly, and Fritz withdrew without another word. I returned to my desk, pencil steady again. Outside, traffic groaned along 35th, fog thick against the lamps. Inside, Wolfe sat vast, motionless, but the air was tight as a drum. The clash had ended without victory, but the war had only begun. The Granada was alive again by dusk, the stage curtains drawn back for rehearsal, dancers warming in mirrored halls, and the bar carrying the hum of glasses struck clean against each other. I had no taste for their gin, but I had a name to collect, and sometimes a $10 bill spoke louder than any badge. The bartender was a lean fellow with sleeves rolled high, hair slicked flat, and eyes that darted like a gambler's watching dice. His cloth wiped endlessly at a glass, though it had been polished twice already. "You pour for more than thirst," I told him, easing a bill across the wood. "And you listen better than most priests. I'm asking about paper, not liquor, something the girl left behind." His hand hovered, then closed over the money with the same grace as a man who'd spent years taking tips without notice. He slid a look toward the corner, checked no one was close, and dipped beneath the bar. When he rose, he held a folded page, edges torn ragged, paper stained faintly with the ring of a glass that once sat upon it. "Ledger," he muttered. "Kept behind the storeroom door. She lifted this when Rosa wasn't looking. Gave it to me to hold. Said if anything happened, maybe it'd keep me in whiskey. Don't tell him. He'd gut me." I took it, unfolded it slowly, eyes drinking the cramped figures inked in a neat clerk's hand. Lines of names and sums stretched down the sheet. Some were familiar, politicians who smiled from papers, businessmen with hands in too many tills, racketeers who had survived Prohibition with fortunes intact. Midway down the page, her name, Lila Dane. Not only present, but circled twice in firm ink, as though to remind whoever read that she mattered. The figures beside her were smaller than the politicians, but the circle gave them weight, marking her as an entry, not an ornament. I folded the paper again, tucked it safe in my inner pocket, and left a second bill for the bartender's silence. He nodded, face pale now that the secret had been traded. By the time I reached the brownstone, the lamps were lit and the city's fog pressed tight against the panes. Wolfe sat anchored as always in his chair, the glow from the desk lamp drawing shadows heavy across his face. Fritz moved quietly at the sideboard, laying plates of cold meat and bread. I drew the folded sheet and placed it square on Wolfe's blotter. "A fragment," I said, "torn from the ledger, paid for with bourbon and silence. Lila's name is circled." Wolfe lifted it with surprising delicacy, as though the paper bore weight greater than gold. His eyes narrowed while he traced the ink, his lips pulling downward into a deeper frown with each line he read. "Politicians," he muttered. "Racketeers, names that do not coexist in ink unless the ink is poison. And the girl. Why circle her? Not for her value. Her earnings are paltry compared to these figures. It was to mark her as lever, not weight. She intended to use this." "Or someone wanted to make sure she couldn't," I countered. "Half a ledger's missing. This page shows a fraction, enough to suggest filth, not enough to indict. The other half's the lock, this is the key." Wolfe leaned back, pressing fingertips together, eyes half closed. Indeed, she possessed it, or intended to. Therefore she was silenced before she could deliver. The missing portion is motive incarnate. Whoever holds it holds the line between survival and ruin. They would kill for it, and have. Fritz shifted softly at the sideboard. "Herr Wolfe," he said, voice low. "The young woman carried too much on fragile shoulders. She did not belong in ledgers." "No," Wolfe agreed, eyes still shut. "But she entered them, and so she was marked. That is the tragedy of ambition. It invites wolves when you are but lamb." I leaned against the desk. "Kramer won't like scraps. He'll call it planted. Claim I lifted it from a coat pocket. He won't chase shadows without the rest of the book." "Kramer," Wolfe said with distaste, "will dismiss until truth slaps his face. We do not wait for his wits. You will pursue the book. The page is bait. Someone will hunt it." I tapped the folded sheet with a finger. "And if they find I have it?" "Then," Wolfe said calmly, "you will be dragged into the same dance, which is why we must lead, not follow. They will stumble. Ambition always does." The clock gave a discreet chime marking the hour. Outside, a horn blared faintly through fog, and the city shuffled onward, restless as ever. In the warm room, Wolfe remained still, heavy with thought, while the torn page rested like a fuse awaiting flame. The car that drew up outside the brownstone was polished to a sheen that mocked the street's grime. A chauffeur in cap and gloves stepped out first, then opened the rear door with the precision of a man who had rehearsed it all his life. Harold Vance emerged, dressed in a grey suit that carried the cut of Fifth Avenue, his tie knotted with care, his hair slicked like polished glass. He paused on the stoop, drew a measured breath, then entered with the air of a man accustomed to invitations, not summons. Fritz led him into the office, his expression discreet but his eyes faintly disapproving of the intrusion. Wolfe sat already in his chair, heavy frame settled like a monarch unwilling to rise. The orchids in the adjoining room cast their faint perfume, and the fire's glow played across the bookshelves. I took my position at my desk, notepad ready, though Vance's kind usually preferred to dictate, not be questioned. "Mr. Wolfe," Vance said smoothly, easing into one of the red chairs without waiting. "I understand you wish to see me regarding that unfortunate girl. A dreadful business, though I fail to see why I am entangled." "You are entangled," Wolfe replied, voice slow, "because she danced for you, and more. Because your name is whispered with hers, and her death was violent. That places you squarely upon the board." Vance's smile was polished, but the muscles of his jaw flickered. "Rumour exaggerates. Yes, I favoured her with some attention. I may have provided certain comforts, but that does not make me a strangler in alleys. On the night in question, I was in Long Island with friends at my lodge. I did not return to the city until dawn." I leaned forward. "Any witnesses?" "Several," Vance said, eyes meeting mine coolly. "3 gentlemen of good standing. They will affirm my presence from evening until near breakfast. We dined, we played cards, we discussed matters of business. My chauffeur drove me, remained with the car, and can attest to every movement." "Your chauffeur," I said. "A man paid to watch doors and swear truth when asked. Forgive me if that sounds convenient." Vance's brows lifted. "Convenience does not erase fact. If you require names, I will supply them. They are not men who would risk perjury for my sake. Their reputations exceed even mine." Wolfe stirred, opening his eyes fully for the first time since Vance entered. "Reputation is brittle, Mr. Vance. It shatters at a single blow. You say you were in Long Island. Did you sleep there?" "I did," Vance answered at once. "With whom?" Wolfe pressed. Vance hesitated only a fraction, then replied, "No one. I retired alone, but the housekeeper will confirm I remained upstairs." "Convenient," Wolfe said dryly. "No one observed you in bed, yet all observed you in parlour. A perfect alibi, airtight, as your kind prefers." Vance leaned forward, voice firm. "Are you accusing me?" "I accuse no one," Wolfe replied. "Without fact. I note only that your recital is rehearsed. Too rehearsed. You deliver it as though reading lines learned at school. That troubles me." Vance's lips thinned and he rose slightly in his chair before settling again. "If precision troubles you, I cannot help it. I will not be slandered for her missteps. She associated widely, recklessly. If she fell, it was her own folly. My presence elsewhere remains provable." Wolfe closed his eyes again, dismissing the weight of Vance's words with the calm of a judge sealing chambers. "Very well. You may go. Leave the names of your companions with Mr. Goodwin. We shall verify. That is all." Vance stood, straightened his cufflinks, and inclined his head with forced civility. "You will find the truth favours me. Good day, gentlemen." He left with the same polish with which he had entered, the door shutting with a soft click. Fritz, returning to collect the empty tray, paused near Wolfe's chair. His eyes lingered a moment longer than usual. Then he departed silently. Wolfe sat motionless, expression unreadable. "He looked steady enough," I said, breaking the silence. 3 men, a chauffeur and a housekeeper. That's an army of voices ready to swear for him. If that's not airtight, I don't know what is." Wolfe grunted. Airtight cases suffocate truth. His recital was too smooth, his timing precise to the minute as if drilled. He answered before you asked. "That is rehearsal. Rehearsal means fear." "You think he staged it?" I asked. "I think," Wolfe replied, "that when a man carries innocence in his pocket like a calling card, it is counterfeit. Perhaps he was in Long Island, perhaps not. But he wished to convince us before we doubted. That is not the rhythm of truth." I scribbled the thought in my notes. Knowing Wolfe's tone meant the words would return later. sharpened into proof. For now, Vance had walked free, his alibi polished like his shoes. But Wolfe had marked the tremor beneath the surface, and I could see him filing it deep, to be drawn when the time was ripe. Outside, fog pressed against the panes, and a car horn echoed faintly from the avenue. Inside, the silence lay heavy, broken only by the faint crackle of fire. Wolfe closed his eyes once more, but I knew better than to believe he had dismissed Vance. He was only waiting, as always, for the truth to betray the lie. The rain had slackened into mist by the time I reached the narrow shop on 8th Avenue, where shoes and glass cases gleamed under yellow bulbs. The smell inside was of polish, leather, and faint starch. Behind the counter stood a clerk in vest and tie, eyes dulled by the monotony of serving chorus girls who needed replacements faster than the floors could chew through soles. He brightened only when I slid a 10 across the wood. Money had the same effect on clerks as it did on bartenders. Sudden memory. "Yes," he said, voice quickening. "She came yesterday. Blonde, neat, with a coat too thin for the weather. Bought a pair of soft white pumps, reinforced toes, satin trim. She said she needed them before morning, seemed anxious." "Lila Dane?" I asked. That was the name she gave. Paid cash, exact change. She carried her old pair in a bag, said they were worn down. I boxed the new ones, but she left with them on her feet. I thanked him, pocketed the receipt stub he found tucked in a drawer, and stepped back into the damp air. The streetcars rattled by, sparks flashing off the wire as mist curled across the rails. My mind turned the picture over. Lila, clutching a new pair of shoes, walking out into rain with determination. She had left the old pair in her bag, the same bag that lay beside her body. But she had died in the old ones, not the new. Somewhere between the shop and the alley she had changed her mind or been forced. By the time I returned to the brownstone, twilight had begun to slide across the city, the lamps flickering into halos in the fog. Fritz had just drawn the curtains, and the office carried the faint warmth of the fire. Wolfe sat anchored in the yellow chair, glass of beer untouched, his brow furrowed in the rare expression of thought that leaned toward irritation. I set the stub on his desk. "Shoes. Bought yesterday, new pair. She wore them out of the store, but when they found her, the old pair was still on her feet, the new ones boxed in her bag. Clark swears she said she needed them before morning." Wolfe opened his eyes, heavy lids narrowing as he reached for the slip. He read the scribbled numbers, then dropped it back. "Explain." "She planned to dance," I said, "or she wanted to be ready for something at dawn. She had the shoes for it. Then, for some reason, she changed back. Maybe she didn't want to ruin the new pair in rain." Wolfe grunted. "No, that is insufficient. Shoes are armor to a dancer. She wore them with intent. To remove them was not whim, it was coercion. Someone demanded she appear as she had before, not as she intended." I frowned. Which ties to her phrase, the dawn waltz. Maybe it wasn't just metaphor. His eyes gleamed. "Precisely. You recall her words? The dawn waltz." She was not speaking of music. She was speaking of schedule. At dawn, a meeting. She wished to present herself with new shoes, symbolic perhaps of new standing, new leverage. Instead, she was forced back into the old, back into her former place. That is not dance, Goodwin. That is rehearsal for death. I leaned against the desk. So it was a meeting, not a performance. A handoff? Ledger pages, maybe? "Possibly," Wolfe replied. "She sought protection for delivery. She purchased shoes to mark the occasion, to make herself feel secure. But the old pair remained. They symbolize continuity, not change. Her killers ensured she remained in them, as message or as mockery." The fire cracked softly. Fritz re-entered, carrying a tray of bread and cheese, his step lighter than the conversation warranted. He set it beside Wolfe, then lingered. His eyes flicked from the stub on the desk to Wolfe's frown, then to me. "She must have hoped for safety," Fritz said quietly. "New shoes for a new morning. It is tragic that she wore the old." Wolfe inclined his head, rare acknowledgement. "Yes, Fritz. Tragic but instructive. Men who kill are not poets, but they are often theatrical. The choice of shoes speaks. We must listen." Fritz withdrew, leaving silence. Wolfe's hands pressed together, fingers steepled. He closed his eyes. "Goodwin, this meeting at dawn. We must know where. She said only the dawn waltz. We assumed music. It is not. It is time. Daybreak was to be the hour of exchange. That she died instead means her killers were prepared before she arrived. They waited. They knew. Inside job? I asked. Or a leak, Wolfe said. Someone she trusted betrayed the schedule. That is why she circled her name in the ledger page. She meant to show she mattered, that she was more than patronage. But ambition without discretion is fatal. I jotted the line, though his tone already carried the verdict. He had shifted the case again, recasting it from passion to plan. Kramer won't swallow it, I said. He'll laugh at shoes as evidence. Kramer, Wolfe replied with disdain, will dismiss until the truth smothers him. He sees only bodies and blunt force. I see nuance. New shoes worn, then removed. A meeting at dawn that became a death. That is no coincidence. That is structure. I watched the firelight lick shadows across the carpet and thought of Lila Dane leaving the shoe shop, Hope wrapped in satin trim. Somewhere between the polished floorboards and the alley's mud, Hope had been stripped from her. She had been forced back into the old, and the old had carried her to death. Wolfe reached for his beer at last, sipped, then set it down untouched a moment later. We must find the other half of the ledger. Only then will the waltz conclude. Until then, Goodwin, watch the dancers. One of them knows the step. The clock chimed softly. Outside, the fog pressed close against the city, heavy as secrets. Inside, Wolfe sat still, but the weight of shoes and waltz hung over us both, the rhythm of dawn still echoing though the dancer lay silent. The apartment on West End Avenue had curtains drawn tight, and a doorman who gave me the kind of look usually reserved for creditors or policemen. He wasn't thrilled to see me, but the right tone in my voice and the flash of credentials did their work. I was admitted, though not welcomed. The lobby smelled of wax and leather polish, and the elevator clanked its way up as though every floor carried one more weight than it could bear. Dominic Ruzza opened his own door, which was unusual for a man with his reputation. He was broad in the shoulders, grey at the temples, with a face that had once belonged to a prizefighter and now belonged to a banker who had never bothered to change the furniture. His voice carried gravel and cigar smoke, though no cigar smouldered in sight. "You're Wolfe's man," he said without warmth. "I'm everyone's man," I answered, stepping past him into the apartment. It was neat, too neat, with carpets from Persia, a bar cart gleaming with bottles that cost more than rent, and photographs in frames showing him 20 years younger, standing beside trucks loaded with barrels. The Volstead Act had been his patron saint. Now he dressed in a silk robe and slippers, pretending the past was dead. He poured 2 drinks, but I left mine untouched on the sideboard. He swallowed his in a single draw, then turned on me with eyes that still carried the steel of alleys. "You're here about the girl," he said. "That's right. She danced, she died, and somewhere between she arranged to meet you." He laughed, though it was bitter. "You think I strangled her? She wanted to meet, yes. She said she had papers, documents that would turn my partners inside out. She said dawn behind the Granada. I told her it was folly. Too many eyes, too much risk. I never went." "Convenient," I said. "You expect me to believe you passed up the chance to put a cork in dynamite before it went off?" He bristled but held his ground. "Listen, Goodwin. I've seen dynamite before. I know when it's a trap. She wanted protection, but she had nothing to bargain with except her own neck. If she'd had the ledger, she wouldn't have been begging me. She'd have been selling to the highest bidder. I told her to wait, to bring them elsewhere, but she wouldn't. Then she's dead, and I'm left with you asking questions." I studied him, the lines on his face cut deep like alleys on a map. He had been around long enough to play truth like a violin, one false note hidden in a melody of facts. "You say you never went," I pressed. "Then how do you know where she died?" He faltered only a second. "Everyone knows. The papers, the cops. They say the alley. I didn't need to see it." "But you did," I said evenly. "Your words gave it away. You said behind the Granada, same place she told you. Not many papers printed that detail yet. The early editions only said near Broadway." His jaw tightened, but he forced a shrug. "So, I know more than the average reader. That doesn't make me guilty." "It makes you sloppy," I said. "Sloppy men don't last long in this city." He poured himself another drink, hand steady though his eyes had dulled. "I swear on my life, I never reached her. If I had, You wouldn't be here. But someone else did. Someone knew the time, the place, and the danger. Don't look at me for that. I may be many things, but I don't kill women in alleys. Not anymore." The last words slipped like gravel. He knew he had said too much, and I let it hang in the silence. The room ticked with the clock on the mantel, and the city outside muttered faintly through curtains. I left him there with his glass, his past, and his half-confession. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was already waiting, hands steepled, eyes narrowed as if the walls themselves had whispered my report ahead of me. Fritz set down a tray with bread and butter, then disappeared. I laid the words out, careful as placing evidence on a scale. "He says she planned to meet him," I finished. "Dawn, behind the Granada. She said she had documents that would ruin his partners. He swears he never went, claims he smelled a trap. But he gave away too much. He knew details not yet in print. Either he went, or someone close to him told him more than he admits." Wolfe's brows twitched, his lids lowered. A slip, the kind careless men make when they believe the room theirs. He claims abstention, yet speaks with knowledge of presence. That is contradiction. Contradiction is fault, and fault points to weakness. "You think he killed her?" "I think," Wolfe replied, "that he feared what she carried, and that fear drove him. But guilt is not proven by fear. The detail he revealed may suggest he was present, or it may suggest confidants betrayed him. We must not leap." I leaned back. "Kramer will jump, though. If I hand him this, he'll have Rosa in irons before supper." "Pfui," Wolfe muttered. "Kramer leaps into pits. We wait. The slip will serve us later, when the pattern is clearer. Until then, we observe." The fire hissed softly in the grate. Wolfe closed his eyes, already filing Rosa's words into some inner cabinet, where they would rest until drawn like a knife. I sat back, listening to the city's hum beyond the window, thinking of Lila Dane walking in new shoes toward dawn. She had planned a meeting, but met her killers instead. Rosa claimed innocence, but his tongue had betrayed him, and Wolfe, immovable, had marked the slip as surely as ink on a ledger. The office held the heavy quiet of late night. Outside, fog pressed against the windows, dimming the glow of street lamps into pale discs. Wolfe sat in his yellow chair, immense and unmoving, his eyes half shut, but his mind awake and turning. The fire muttered low in the grate, and Fritz had withdrawn after setting down a tray of bread and cold meats. I was at my desk, pen idle above paper, waiting for Wolfe to break the silence. He did at last, with the slow gravity of a man speaking judgment. "Goodwin," he said, "we will bring them here, all of them. Vance, Klein, Ritter, Rosa, even Kramer. I dislike clutter, but this requires it." "An assembly," I remarked. "The full cast. What's the occasion?" "Occasion?" Wolfe's lip curled. "The occasion is murder. A woman solicited my protection and died hours later. Her folly imposed upon me, and now I will impose upon them. They will come, and they will listen, and one will betray himself." I leaned back, watching the shadows flicker against his bulk. "You mean your customary theatre, with us as ushers, Kramer as heckler, and the guilty man sweating until he cracks?" "Precisely," Wolfe replied, "but with one alteration. The hour. We will meet at dawn." That drew me upright. "Dawn? You've sworn against the morning since the day I met you." His eyes glinted. "Which is why it will confound them. The crime was arranged for dawn. Its symbol was a waltz at dawn. Her shoes were purchased for dawn. Therefore we shall replicate the hour. The rhythm of events must be echoed so that falsehood falters." I whistled softly. "Fritz will love that. He'll be setting out eggs while the city's still snoring." "Fritz," Wolfe said, "will prepare a breakfast worthy of inquiry. Bread, coffee, eggs, honey, fruit. He will serve it precisely at first light. Symbol matters." I could see Fritz's expression already, polite as a prayer but tight at the corners. Still, when I relayed the order later, he only inclined his head, though his hands pressed longer than usual against the silver tray he polished. "Very well, Herr Wolfe," he said. "If justice requires eggs at dawn, then eggs at dawn it shall be. Though I must say, the young woman has left you restless, more restless than I have seen before." Wolfe's eyes flickered open at that, surprised but not rebuking. He gave no answer, but the silence served. Fritz bowed and withdrew. The next hours were mine. I set the calls one by one, leaning against the phone stand with pens scratching notes. Klein sputtered but agreed. Ritter laughed bitterly but agreed. Vance tried to turn it aside, but the name of Wolfe carried weight, and he too consented. Rosa spoke little, only gave a grunt, which in his vocabulary meant compliance. Kramer barked down the line, cursed, and then declared he would come, if only to ensure Wolfe did not pervert his case. The stage was set. When I told Wolfe all had agreed, he only inclined his head. "They will arrive uneasy," he said. "That is essential. Fear, phrase, control." He sat deeper into the chair, lips pressed thin, hands folded across his stomach. His irritation lingered in the air like smoke, though no cigar burned in sight. He did not name it, but I could feel its root. The girl. She had entered his house at dawn, trembling and hopeful, and now lay silent in the morgue. Wolfe could dismiss fools with contempt, but this one had pierced him, however faintly. His annoyance was his grief translated into terms he could endure. I wrote my notes until the fire burned low. At last Wolfe stirred. "Goodwin," he said, "when they gather, you will watch not their words but their eyes. The ledger remains the fulcrum. Half is missing, half is here. One among them knows the whole. That man will betray knowledge when I force him to see what he believes hidden." "You'll have them cornered," I said. "Yes," Wolfe replied, "but the trap must be sprung at the precise hour, not before." The clock struck 2, then 3. Manhattan muttered in its sleep. I dozed briefly at my desk, woke at Fritz's soft tread as he moved with German precision through the kitchen, preparing a breakfast no sane man should cook at such an hour. The scent of coffee filled the brownstone, richer than incense, sharper than resolve. By the time dawn greyed the windows, the office was set. The red chairs stood in a semicircle, polished and waiting. The tray was laid, gleaming with silver and porcelain. The fire glowed, though faint, enough to cast light against the heavy curtains. Wolfe sat upright in the yellow chair, robe replaced with suit, his eyes open and unblinking. I studied him as the first bell rang. He was more irritable than usual, yes, but not with me or Fritz or even Kramer. It was with fate. A woman had sought his protection and he had refused. Now he would bend fate back upon itself with logic and display. The girl was gone, but Wolfe would not let her vanish without consequence. The suspects would arrive soon, one by one, each carrying secrets like concealed weapons. Wolfe would dissect them with words as dawn spilled across the room, and I, watching, knew he was more invested than he would ever admit. He had called it intolerable that her folly had imposed upon him, but what I saw in his eyes, sharper than his irritation, was something rarer, the shadow of pity. The Granada smelled of powder and sweat when I returned. The dressing rooms cluttered with sequined costumes, discarded stockings, and mirrors rimmed with bulbs glowing faint yellow. A cleaner pushed a mop down the corridor, humming a tune, paying me no mind once I flashed the badge of authority Wolfe always insisted I keep at hand. The girls were gone, rehearsals over, leaving only silence that carried their perfume like ghosts. I stepped into Lila Dane's old room, small and crowded, the kind of place where ambition lived in trunks and hat boxes. Her chair still bore a smudge of rouge on the armrest, her mirror a lipstick kiss faint on the corner. I began with drawers, careful not to disturb what Kramer's men had already poured through. Nothing but powder tins, hairpins, a broken compact. The wastebasket yielded only paper torn too fine to reassemble. My eye shifted to the rack of costumes. Silks, satins, feathers, each stitched for 1,000 evenings and hurried undressings. I ran a hand along the seams, pressing lightly. One costume, a blue sequined gown with a slit running high at the hip, felt heavier than the rest. I lifted it from its hanger, laid it across the chair and pressed again. The lining bulged faintly, stiff where it should have flowed. I drew a knife from my pocket, slit a careful seam, and there it was. Folded sheets, brittle at the edges, smelling of ink and dust. Ledger pages, the missing half. I unfolded them slowly, the inked lines marching down in the same neat clerk's hand as the fragment Wolfe held in his office. Names leapt from the page like sparks from a wire. Not dancers, not patrons of champagne, but officials, men who held the city in their fists. Against them, numbers, sums paid out like lifeblood. Midway down, circled not once but twice, the name Harold Vance. His figure exceeded all others, dwarfing even the politicians, and beside his line, scrawled in a darker hand, a note, to silence the Albany matter, delivered to Klein. The room seemed smaller with those words in it, the bulb's glow harsher, the air thicker. I folded the sheets, slipped them into my pocket, and stitched the seam again with a dancer's needle I found on the desk. No one would know where I had found them, save Wolfe. By the time I reached the brownstone, night had folded over Manhattan, fog curling low against the avenue. Wolfe sat in his yellow chair, the fire snapping in the grate, his eyes closed as though in retreat from the world's noise. Fritz moved about with quiet efficiency, setting supper. I laid the folded ledger before Wolfe, and his eyes opened with a spark. He lifted the sheets, read line by line, lips pressed tight as though each figure added weight to the air. "Vance," he said at last, "as I suspected. Not merely patronage, not merely dalliance. He paid Klein to silence scandal. Politicians tied, city officials bound, and his own name circled like a brand. Fui." I dropped into the red chair, stretching legs stiff from crouching in the dressing room. His alibi in Long Island was neat enough to frame, but the ink here says otherwise. He was here, in this city, buying silence. "Yes," Wolfe murmured. The manager vouched for him. Klein, under pressure, no doubt threatened or bribed. The figures confirm it. Vance's entry was not entertainment but extortion. A matter in Albany hushed with currency, routed through Klein. The ledger proves presence, not absence. His story of Long Island was fabrication. The chauffeur, the companions, rehearsed lies. Now it collapses. He turned another page, scanning names that would make headlines if Kramer ever held them. "This," Wolfe said slowly, "is the fulcrum. The girl held it, or knew where it lay. She circled her own name, not for vanity, but as insurance. To say, I am within this record, therefore I matter, and therefore she died." Fritz, who had lingered by the sideboard, set down the silver tray with care. "Herr Wolfe," he said softly, "this girl has unsettled you. You do not usually take pity." Wolfe's head lifted sharply, but he did not rebuke him. Instead he sighed, a sound heavy as stone. "She was foolish, yes, but not wicked. She wished to climb, and men used her rungs to cover their descent. It is intolerable." I scribbled notes, though the words etched themselves into memory. "So Vance is finished. We tie the ledger to him, show Klein folded under weight, and the alibi cracks. But Kramer won't take it easy. He'll demand the full chain." "He shall have it," Wolfe replied, voice steady. "But first, we must prepare. Evidence must be introduced with inevitability. Vance will squirm, deny, rage. Then the page will fall, like an axe. He will be undone." The clock ticked steadily. Wolfe sat still, the ledger pages spread like maps of corruption across his desk. The city outside rumbled, but here in the warm office the truth was laid bare. Vance, patron of dancers, benefactor of politicians, had paid to silence scandal. His alibi, rehearsed to perfection, now cracked beneath ink that could not be rehearsed. And Wolfe, irritated though he had been, seemed calmer now, as though the girl's voice, silenced in the alley, spoke again through the ledger. The brownstone was never designed for assemblies, but Wolfe had decreed it, and so the red chairs were drawn into a semicircle, polished to a sheen beneath the steady glow of the desk lamp. Outside, dawn light pressed faint and grey against the curtains, bleeding through in thin stripes. The city murmured with trucks shifting gears on 35th, but inside the office there was only the hush of anticipation. Wolfe sat in the yellow chair, broad frame immovable, hands steepled across his stomach. His eyes were half-lidded, yet the room seemed to bend toward him as though awaiting judgment. They arrived in uneven order. Klein first, the manager, with his collar damp from fog and his lips twitching as though he longed for a cigarette he dared not light in Wolfe's presence. Ritter, lean and sullen, dropped into a chair as though the room itself offended him. Vance entered with his customary polish, grey suit immaculate, hair combed with care, his smile smooth as marble though his eyes betrayed strain. Rosa came behind, heavy in step, shoulders filling the doorway, his gaze carrying the threat of alleys and warehouses. Finally, Kramer stamped in, his hat flung on my desk, his coat dripping mist onto the rug. He glared at Wolfe as though daring him to falter. Fritz moved silently between them, setting out trays of eggs, bread and coffee as though breakfast at dawn were the most natural of rituals. Wolfe let them sit, let them taste discomfort, let the silence work upon them until the shuffle of feet and the clink of forks became unbearable. Then, with calm gravity, he spoke. "Gentlemen, you are here because a woman is dead. She was young, foolish, ambitious. She sought protection, and I refused her. Hours later, she was strangled behind the Granada. The police, represented by Inspector Kramer, have questioned you, yet the truth remains clouded. I do not intend to let it remain so." Vance cleared his throat. "Mr. Wolfe, I must protest. To be summoned here at such an hour as though on trial—" "Be silent," Wolfe cut in, voice sharp. "Your protest is noted, irrelevant, and dismissed. You will listen. If you have the effrontery to interrupt again, you may leave, and I shall send the police to your door within the hour." Kramer gave a grunt of approval, though it was aimed more at Wolfe's severity than his courtesy. Wolfe shifted slightly, a movement of great weight. The girl, Lila Dane, possessed, or claimed to possess, pages from a ledger. Those pages recorded sums paid to politicians and men of influence. Half the ledger was concealed until Mr. Goodwin, through persistence and bribery, recovered it from her costume. The entries are illuminating. They reveal sums delivered through Klein, manager of the Granada. They reveal the name Dominic Ruzza, partner silent only in voice. And they reveal, most prominently, Harold Vance. All eyes turned to Vance. He adjusted his tie with fingers that trembled more than he intended. That ledger is fabrication. Anyone could have written it. "Phooey," Wolfe muttered. "The ink, the hand, the records of Klein's accounts all corroborate. You, Mr. Vance, paid heavily to silence scandal. An Albany matter involving city officials hushed by Klein at your behest. That is fact. And when the girl threatened to expose it, you silenced her as well." Vance sprang half from his chair. "That's outrageous. I was in Long Island the entire night. My companions will swear to it, as will my chauffeur. Are you calling them liars?" "Yes," Wolfe said calmly. "Liars rehearsed. Their testimony's too precise, their timing too neat. Truth stumbles. Lies march in rhythm. You were not in Long Island. You were here in Manhattan, desperate to intercept her before dawn." Klein shifted, face pale, voice thin. He asked me to vouch, yes. Said it was only for an evening, to cover appearances. I didn't know it would lead to this." Kramer slammed a fist on my desk. "So you admit it, Klein. You vouched false." "I had no choice," Klein stammered. "He owns half the men who keep this club open. If I refused, I'd be finished." Wolfe raised a hand, silencing the room. His voice dropped, slower now, measured as a judge's gavel. "Mr. Vance, you claim to have departed Manhattan before the girl's death. Your chauffeur swore you were on the road before sunrise. That was the linchpin of your alibi. Do you recall his words?" Vance swallowed, nodded stiffly. "He said we left at dawn." "Indeed," Wolfe said. "He said the sun was rising as you entered the car. That was his mistake. The sun did not rise that morning until 6 minutes past 6. Yet Miss Dane was already dead by 5:30, her body found while the city was still grey. Your chauffeur spoke of a sun that had not yet appeared. He described a dawn that existed only after her death. Therefore, his testimony is false, rehearsed to match your tale, and your alibi collapses." The silence that followed was heavy as stone. Ritter stared, mouth half open. Ruzza shifted but said nothing, his eyes dark with satisfaction that the noose was tightening around another. Klein dabbed at his brow with a handkerchief, his guilt now dwarfed by Vance's ruin. Vance tried once more. His voice broke, his polish cracking. "You can't. This is supposition. A slip of memory, nothing more. Men mistake the hour." "No," Wolfe said, voice cold. "Men mistake minutes, not the presence of the sun. The chauffeur described a dawn he never saw because he was never there. He spoke words you placed in his mouth. And you, Mr. Vance, strangled Lila Dane to keep her silent. You killed her because she threatened to expose the payments that tether you to City Hall. That is the truth." Vance's face drained of colour. His hands gripped the chair arms until his knuckles blanched. Then, with a shuddering breath, he broke. "She wouldn't stop," he whispered. I begged her. She had the pages, waved them like a torch. She said she'd go to the papers if I didn't buy her protection. I couldn't let it happen. Everything I built, everything I owned, gone in a headline. I followed her, begged her again, but she laughed, said I'd pay or fall. I couldn't. His voice cracked and he pressed his hands over his eyes. I killed her. God help me, I killed her. Kramer surged to his feet, snapping orders to the two men he had stationed outside. They entered, hands gripping Vance's shoulders, dragging him up. He sagged, no longer polished, no longer composed, his confession echoing in the warm office. Klein cowered, Ritter shivered, Rosa smirked, and Wolfe sat still, immovable, as though he had merely identified a species of insect. Kramer turned to Wolfe, his face flushed with the satisfaction of triumph. "You've done it again, Wolfe. Damn you, you've done it. But this time you've cost me ulcers. If you'd told me sooner—" "Inspector," Wolfe interrupted, "I tell you when evidence breathes, not before. You may have ulcers, but you also have your man. Take him." The officers hauled Vance out, his protest gone, his shoulders bowed. The door shut behind them, leaving the room thick with silence once more. Fritz moved softly, clearing untouched plates, his face grave. Ritter muttered something about ruin and fled. Klein followed, wringing his hands. Rosa lingered, nodded once to Wolfe, then departed without word. At last only Wolfe, Kramer, Fritz and I remained. Kramer replaced his hat, grunted, and left without another word. Fritz gathered the final dishes, then slipped away, leaving the office in the hush of early light. I leaned back, stretching legs stiff from hours of tension. Well, that's that. The dawn waltz finished with one man led off in chains. Wolfe closed his eyes. Yes, the girl danced for ambition, and her partner was death. I prefer orchids. The fire snapped softly. Outside, the sun at last rose fully above the city, but in the brownstone the case had ended, and silence returned. The brownstone breathed again, that familiar rhythm of ordered quiet restored after storm and strain. Outside, the day was sharpening, traffic rolling heavier along 35th Street, horns breaking the pale haze that drifted past the curtains. Inside, though, the air carried only the clean perfume of brewed coffee and the faint sizzle of butter from Fritz's dominion below. The case was finished, the girl buried in consequence, and the house resumed its pulse of calm. Wolfe had returned to his chair as if to a throne reclaimed, its cushions reshaped to his weight, its armrests familiar to his touch. He sat composed, hands resting as if in truce, but his eyes carried the residue of distaste. On the low table before him stood a tray, eggs folded into silken layers, a dish of Montenegrin honey gleaming like amber under lamplight, bread cut with Fritz's precision, and a pot of coffee breathing steam through silver. He drew breath, lifted his fork, and began the meal as though ceremony itself might restore order to the world. Kramer had not left so easily. He paced across the rug, boots heavy, hat crumpled in one hand, his expression a mixture of begrudging satisfaction and enduring irritation. His voice carried its usual rasp, sharpened further by the long night. "You might have spared me some ulcers, Wolfe, if you'd laid it straight at the start, instead of staging a performance with half the city in your office." Wolfe did not look up. He tasted the eggs, nodded faintly at Fritz, who lingered near the doorway with a towel folded on his arm, then replied without haste. "Inspector, if I'd given you the fragments when they were yet disjointed, you would have trampled them into uselessness. I prefer to present a complete pattern. It spares confusion, though it may displease you." "It damn well does," Kramer barked. He jammed his hat onto his head, then pulled it off again, too restless to depart. "You had the ledger, the girls' meeting, the lies about Long Island, and still you waited until sunrise to spring the whole thing like some magician with a rabbit." Archie, leaning against the desk, watching Wolfe consume breakfast with the focus of a priest at altar, added mildly, "Not a rabbit, Inspector. More like a weasel that strangled a girl to keep his paws clean. The rabbit was the girl herself, and she didn't get out of the hat alive." Kramer gave me a sour glance but said nothing. Wolfe dipped a spoon into the honey, let it slide golden across his bread, and spoke again with that calm gravity that never shifted with anger or pity. "The girl danced for money at night, but in her final hours she pursued a truth that might have spared her. Beauty and folly are often companions. She lacked prudence but not courage. That combination is fatal more often than not. Fritz cleared his throat softly, disapproval hidden in courtesy. He set down a small porcelain dish of preserves and stepped back, his eyes betraying a rare shadow of grief. Wolfe inclined his head in acknowledgement, then returned to his plate. Kramer's patience frayed. He snatched his coat from the rack, threw it across his shoulders, and turned toward the door. "You think you can dress up a strangling with poetry, Wolfe, but the girl's still dead, and I've got paperwork piled from here to Center Street. Enjoy your eggs. I'll be enjoying ulcers." He stamped out, the door thudding behind him like a gavel. The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the measured scrape of Wolfe's fork and the occasional sound of Fritz adjusting dishes on the tray. The office had known such silences before, after triumphs bitter and sweet, but this one lingered with a trace of sorrow that clung like fog. I crossed to the window, pulled the curtain a fraction, and let the daylight spill in. The street was alive now, delivery trucks grumbling, a boy calling headlines, a woman with a basket moving briskly along the pavement. Ordinary life had resumed without pause. I turned back, studied Wolfe, and spoke in a tone meant to balance levity with reflection. She danced for money under chandeliers and velvet, but at the end she was chasing daylight truth, and daylight strangled her. There's a kind of irony in that, don't you think? Wolfe chewed, swallowed, and looked at me with eyes that softened only by degrees. Irony, Archie, is a device for writers. For men and women, it is suffering clothed in wit. The girl sought protection through leverage. She believed beauty would purchase safety, that folly would be forgiven. But beauty fades and folly accumulates. She left herself unshielded. I poured myself coffee from the pot Fritz had placed, letting the steam curl upward. She was green but gutsy. She thought she could dance with wolves and come away with silk gloves. "Wolves bite," Wolfe said, returning to his honey, "even when the dance is a waltz." Fritz gathered the empty dishes with silent care, the clink of porcelain against silver delicate as if reverence were owed the food itself. He carried the tray from the room, leaving behind only the faint aroma of butter and honey. The office seemed to exhale, relieved of tension at last. The red chairs stood vacant, each bearing the memory of a suspect's shifting weight, each now harmless furniture once more. The desk gleamed in order, papers stacked, ink bottle capped, pens aligned. Wolfe, replete, leaned back, eyes closing for a moment as though conceding that the world might run without his supervision for an hour. I stretched, pulled my notebook from my pocket and flicked it open. The pages bore my handwriting, quick, slanted, recording fragments of the night, the ledger, the slips, the confessions. I tapped the cover against my knee, then looked at Wolfe again. "So, that's it. Another one down. City officials bribed, a patron ruined, a girl dead, and you with honey on your lips. Makes a man wonder if justice is ever more than a word on paper." Wolfe opened his eyes, heavy and steady. "Justice is a conception, Archie. Men strive toward it and stumble. It is not honey. It does not sweeten. It is merely balance. The girl tipped it, and balance was restored. That is all." I closed the notebook, slipped it away, and gave a short laugh. Balance doesn't sit well with me when the scales have a body on them. But I suppose you're right. She made her choice, and Vance made his. One ended in a grave, the other in a cell, and we're left here with eggs and coffee. "Yes," Wolfe murmured, his eyelids lowering again, "and orchids." The clock ticked steady, a pendulum marking time with untroubled indifference. Upstairs, the orchids waited for their morning attendance, and I knew Wolfe would rise soon to give them the ritual care that outlasted murders and scandals alike. The world could collapse, but the orchids demanded their hour. I lit a lamp against the daylight, preferring the warm glow to the raw sun outside, and settled into my chair with the paper. The headlines would blare about Vance by evening. By tomorrow, the girl's name would fade from print. But in the office, her dance would linger, one more step in the endless reel of folly and crime that paid our rent. Wolfe stirred, opened his eyes once more, and fixed me with a gaze that held both irritation and something softer. "Archie, your reflections are tedious when drawn at such length. Attend to your notes, not philosophy." I grinned. "Yes, sir. Philosophy is yours, and the legwork mine. Balance again." He grunted, reached for the last slice of bread, and spread it with honey as though sealing the conclusion. Outside, a horn blared, a dog barked, the city surged onward. Inside, the brownstone folded back into its rhythm, secure, deliberate, immune to the frenzy beyond its walls. The case was over. Breakfast was complete, and Nero Wolfe in his chair allowed the world to spin without further interference.